A homeless man was dragged out of a five-star hotel, humiliated in front of everyone. The staff laughed. The guests looked away. But just 1 hour later, he walked back in, not as a beggar, but as the owner. What happened next left the entire hotel in stunned silence. The lobby of the Grand Royal Hotel was a masterpiece of luxury. Marble floors gleamed under the golden chandeliers, and the scent of expensive cologne lingered in the air. Guests in designer suits and silk dresses moved with effortless grace, their laughter echoing like a melody of privilege. At the reception desk, a polished concierge welcomed yet another high-profile guest with a rehearsed smile. Everything in this five-star sanctuary was designed to exude exclusivity. And then, he walked in. The man's presence was an immediate disruption. His coat, tattered and oversized, barely hung onto his thin frame. His shoes, once black, were now a dull gray, scuffed and torn at the edges. His face was lined with exhaustion, his hair unkempt, and yet his eyes held something unusual. Not desperation, not pleading, but a quiet, almost unsettling certainty. For a moment, the opulent lobby seemed to pause, as if the grand interior itself rejected his existence. A woman in a pearl necklace wrinkled her nose and took a step back. A businessman glanced over his shoulder and muttered something under his breath. The hotel staff, conditioned to maintain perfection, exchanged silent looks, their eyes flickering toward the security guard stationed near the entrance. The man walked forward, his footsteps light but deliberate. He approached the reception desk, where a young employee hesitated before forcing a polite yet distant smile. "Sir, may I help you?" His voice was low, controlled. "A cup of coffee, just one." He reached into his pocket, fingers brushing against the last few crumpled bills he had. Before the receptionist could answer, a voice, sharp, dismissive, cut through the air. "He doesn't belong here." A middle-aged man in a pristine navy blue suit stood near the bar, a glass of whiskey in hand. Richard Davenport, the hotel's general manager. He didn't even bother lowering his voice. "This is a five-star establishment, not a shelter." The tension in the room thickened. The staff pretended not to hear. The guests turned their backs. The homeless man remained still, his expression unreadable. "I can pay," he said, his tone calm, undisturbed. Richard scoffed. "That's not the point. This is a place for people who—" He gestured vaguely, as if words failed to capture the distinction between people like himself and people like the man before him. The security guards had already begun to move, slow but purposeful, waiting for the inevitable order. Behind the reception desk, an elderly concierge, Mr. Holloway, watched with a furrowed brow. Unlike the others, he didn't turn away. Instead, his eyes studied the homeless man, his posture, his presence, the way he moved. There was something familiar. A flicker of recognition crossed his face, but before he could say anything, Richard snapped his fingers. "Throw him out." The security guard stepped forward. The man didn't resist. He didn't beg. As they grabbed his arms and dragged him across the pristine floor, he let out a soft sigh, as if this were merely a slight inconvenience rather than a public humiliation. But just as he reached the entrance, something caught his eye. A painting. Large, imposing, hanging elegantly above the fireplace. It depicted an old city skyline, one that had changed over the years, except for one particular building that remained unchanged in the background. The Grand Royal Hotel. For the first time, his lips curved into the faintest hint of a smile. Mr. Holloway noticed. His breath hitched, but before he could speak, the doors swung open, and the homeless man was cast out into the cold. The cold air outside bit into his skin as he landed unceremoniously on the pavement. The heavy glass doors of the Grand Royale swung shut behind him, sealing him out like an unwanted stain on their perfect world. For a moment, he remained still, adjusting to the harsh contrast between the warmth of luxury and the unforgiving chill of the streets. Laughter trickled through the glass. Inside, guests had already returned to their drinks, their conversations, their indulgent lives. To them, he was a momentary disturbance, an insignificant interruption in their evening. But not to Richard Davenport. Standing at the bar, the general manager swirled the whiskey in his glass, watching through the window with a smirk of satisfaction. "You see that?" he mused to a group of wealthy patrons lounging nearby. "That's the problem these days. They think they can just walk in anywhere." A woman in a shimmering silver dress chuckled, twirling the stem of her martini. Honestly, he should be grateful. At least now he knows his place. Another guest, a man in an impeccably tailored suit, grinned. "I'll tell you what, Richard," he said, resting an elbow on the polished bar top. "If that guy can afford anything in this hotel, I'll buy him a suite for a year." Laughter erupted around them. Someone raised a toast. But amid the indulgence, Mr. Holloway, the elderly concierge, remained silent. His wrinkled hands gripped the edge of the desk as he stared at the doors, a shadow of unease crossing his face. Outside, the homeless man dusted off his coat, exhaling slowly. He didn't look angry. He didn't even look surprised. If anything, there was something almost amused in the way he straightened his sleeves, as if this were merely an inconvenience. Nothing more. Then, he reached into his pocket, pulled out a simple black phone, and made a call. "It's time," he said simply. Inside, Richard continued basking in the admiration of his guests when a younger hotel employee approached, an uneasy look on his face. "Sir, there's a call for you," he said, hesitant. Richard sighed, annoyed. "Handle it." "It's from headquarters." The word sent a ripple through the room. Richard exchanged a glance with the bartender before snatching the phone from the staff member's hand. "This is Richard Davenport," he said smoothly. The voice on the other end was calm, professional, but beneath the neutrality was an edge of something sharper. "Effective immediately, Mr. Davenport, you are relieved of your duties as general manager of the Grand Royale Hotel." Silence. For the first time that evening, Richard's smirk faltered. "Excuse me?" "Ownership of the property has changed hands. You'll be given further instructions regarding your severance package. Security will escort you out within the hour." Richard's grip on the phone tightened. "That's ridiculous," he scoffed. "Who the hell do you think you are?" A pause. Then, "The new owner." The call disconnected. Richard stood frozen, his breath short. Around him, the guests who had moments ago been laughing at the homeless man's expense were now watching him, sensing the shift in his demeanor. His face, usually smug and controlled, had gone rigid, his knuckles white around the phone. Then, the doors swung open, and the man they had thrown out an hour ago walked back inside. This time, he wasn't a homeless man. He was their boss. The moment he stepped inside, the entire lobby seemed to hold its breath. The same man they had humiliated, thrown onto the cold pavement like trash, was now walking across the marble floor with an air of quiet authority. His posture was unchanged, his coat still worn and tattered, but something was different. The weight in his steps, the confidence in his stride, it sent a ripple of unease through the room. Richard Davenport remained frozen behind the bar, his whiskey glass trembling slightly in his grip. His mind scrambled for an explanation, something, anything that could make sense of what was happening. But as the homeless man, no, the new owner, advanced toward the front desk, reality settled in like a vice around his throat. Gasps broke the silence. Guests who had laughed at him earlier were now shifting uncomfortably in their seats, murmuring among themselves. The same receptionist who had dismissed him with a forced smile was now wide-eyed, her hands gripping the edge of the desk as if it were the only thing keeping her upright. And then, Mr. Holloway, who had been watching everything unfold from his place behind the counter, spoke first. "Sir," he said, voice barely above a whisper, filled with something almost like recognition. The man turned slightly, locking eyes with the elderly concierge. For the first time, he truly smiled. "It's been a long time, Holloway," he said. The old man inhaled sharply, the color draining from his face. He took a small, shaky step back, glancing up at the grand chandelier above them, as if he were suddenly standing in a different time, a different version of this hotel. Richard finally snapped out of his trance. He slammed his whiskey glass onto the counter, his voice regaining its usual sharpness, laced with anger. "What the hell is going on?" he demanded, striding toward the reception desk. His eyes burned into the receptionist, as if she could somehow undo what had just happened. "Is this some kind of joke?" The homeless man, the owner, tilted his head slightly, as if considering the question. "A joke?" he mused. "Number. But it's certainly poetic." Richard clenched his jaw. "You expect me to believe that some nobody off the street suddenly owns the Grand Royale? That's absurd." The man's gaze darkened. "Nobody?" A slow, heavy silence spread through the lobby. Mr. Holloway finally broke it. "Sir, if I may." His voice was careful, like someone stepping onto fragile ice. He turned to Richard, his eyes filled with something close to fear. "This man? This is the Grand Royale." Richard scoffed. "What the hell are you talking about?" The homeless man exhaled softly, looking around the lobby as if it were a relic of another life. His fingers trailed along the polished marble desk, his touch lingering over the surface as if it belonged to him. And then he spoke. "This hotel was built 40 years ago by my father," he said, his voice smooth, controlled. "It was meant to be more than just a sanctuary for the rich. It was meant to be a legacy, a place where service mattered more than status." A murmur spread through the guests, some exchanging confused glances. Richard scoffed again, his bravado cracking slightly. "That's a nice story," he sneered. "But the Grand Royale was bought out a decade ago. The original owner lost everything and disappeared." The man's lips twitched at the corner, something dangerously close to amusement flickering across his face. "Yes," he said simply. "He did." Realization hit. A few guests gasped audibly. Richard's face paled. No, it couldn't be. "James Blackwell." Mr. Holloway was the one to say it. His voice was barely above a whisper, but it rang through the silent lobby like a gunshot. James Blackwell, the son of the Grand Royale's original founder, the heir to a hospitality empire that had been stolen from him after a series of devastating losses, a man who had vanished from the industry entirely, presumed to have fallen into ruin, if not worse. And now, he was back. Richard took a step back, shaking his head. This is some kind of scam, some trick." James said nothing. He simply reached into his pocket and pulled out a single sheet of paper, a deed, a legal document stamped, signed, and irrefutable. He owned everything. The room tilted around Richard. He felt it in his gut. A freefall, a spiraling loss of control. His name, his title, his power, all gone in an instant. And James Blackwell? He was watching him drown. Richard clenched his fists. You think you can just walk in here and take everything back? His voice was desperate now, laced with venom. You're still just a pathetic bum in a torn coat. Owning this place doesn't change that. A few people gasped. Others looked away, ashamed for him. James, however, did not react. He simply exhaled slowly and nodded. I thought you might say that, he murmured. Then he turned his head slightly and spoke over his shoulder. Holloway. The old concierge snapped to attention. James's voice was calm, measured. Remove Mr. Davenport from the premises. For a moment, silence reigned. Then, two security guards stepped forward. Richard's eyes widened. You can't be serious. James met his gaze, unblinking. Oh, I am. The guards grabbed Richard's arms. He struggled, rage twisting his features. I've been running this hotel for 5 years, he shouted. You can't just throw me out like some piece of garbage. James took a slow step forward, lowering his voice just enough so only Richard could hear. You threw me out first. Richard's breath hitched. Then, the doors swung open, and this time, it was him being cast out into the cold. The heavy glass doors slammed shut behind Richard Davenport, sealing his fate just as he had done to James an hour ago. Outside, the once proud hotel manager stumbled onto the pavement, his tailored suit now nothing more than a symbol of his former power. The cold air hit him like a slap, but it wasn't the temperature that made him shiver. It was the sheer weight of humiliation. Inside the Grand Royale, an eerie silence lingered. Every eye was glued to James Blackwell, the man they had mocked, dismissed, and discarded as a nobody. Now, he stood before them, not as a beggar, not as an intruder, but as the owner of everything they had once thought was beyond his reach. The receptionist, the one who had barely concealed her distaste earlier, swallowed hard. The bartender, who had smirked when Richard ordered security to throw James out, looked away, suddenly very interested in polishing an already spotless glass. The guests, who had whispered and laughed, now sat stiffly in their seats, afraid to move, afraid to be noticed. And then James spoke. His voice wasn't loud, yet it carried across the lobby, steady and deliberate. I built this place, he said, his fingers grazing the smooth marble counter, the same one his father had once proudly designed. Not with money, not with luxury, with principles, with the belief that respect is not reserved for the rich. That service is not just for those who can afford it. That a hotel is more than just a business. It's a home. A murmur spread through the room. Shame crept into the eyes of those who had been so quick to judge him, so eager to strip him of his dignity. James took a slow step forward, his presence commanding, yet composed. I was thrown out of my own legacy. I lost everything. And yet, here I am. His gaze swept over the stunned crowd. Meanwhile, those who held the power, they became arrogant, corrupt, careless. No one dared to look up. Mr. Holloway, standing behind the reception desk, watched with quiet reverence. He had known. Somehow, deep in his bones, he had recognized James long before the truth came to light. And now, as he stood there, witnessing the rise of the rightful owner, he felt something rare in the air. Justice. James turned slightly, his focus now on the employees, those who had enforced the hierarchy, who had upheld the unspoken rule that people like him did not belong. The problem with power, James said, his voice dipping into something dangerously calm, is that people forget it isn't permanent. A chilling pause. Then he let out a breath, slow and measured. Effective immediately. Anyone who participated in my removal, anyone who judged me without knowing me, is fired. The silence was absolute. The receptionist let out a small gasp, her hand flying to her mouth. The bartender's face turned ghostly pale. Whispers rippled through the room. Some employees stood frozen, paralyzed by fear. James's gaze remained impassive. This was not revenge. This was consequence. And then he turned to Mr. Holloway. "You," he said, his voice softer now. "You saw me." The old concierge blinked, uncertainty flickering in his eyes. James nodded slightly, a flicker of warmth breaking through his steel exterior. "You stay." For a long moment, Mr. Holloway said nothing. Then, with a trembling hand, he straightened his uniform and bowed his head ever so slightly, a silent acknowledgement of loyalty, repaid. The lobby remained in stunned stillness. James glanced around one last time, taking in the faces of those who had watched his downfall and now stood witness to his return. Then, in one smooth motion, he turned and walked away, leaving them all standing in the ruins of their own arrogance. Outside, Richard Davenport stood frozen on the pavement, the weight of his downfall settling in like a slow-burning fire. The Grand Royale loomed behind him, its golden lights spilling onto the streets, but he no longer belonged to that world. The power, the prestige, the untouchable authority, gone. The doorman, the same one who had eagerly opened the doors for VIP guests and closed them in James Blackwell's face, now hesitated. For the first time, he looked at Richard not as a man of power, but as a man stripped of everything. Richard let out a hollow laugh, shaking his head. Just an hour ago, he had been the one standing tall, looking down on those beneath him. And now? Now, he was nothing more than a shadow outside the doors he once ruled. Inside, the tension lingered, thick and unspoken. Employees who had once prided themselves on catering to only the wealthiest now stood in awkward silence, afraid to meet James Blackwell's gaze. The guests, once quick to judge, shifted uncomfortably, suddenly aware of how fragile their own positions were. Mr. Holloway, still standing behind the desk, let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The weight of years, of secrets, of silent regrets, now lifted. He looked at James, not as a beggar, not as a stranger, but as the rightful owner who had returned. James didn't bask in his victory. He didn't demand an apology or revel in the humiliation of those who had wronged him. Instead, he adjusted his worn coat, his expression unreadable. This was never about revenge. It was about reclaiming what was his. With quiet finality, he turned away from the spectacle, walking toward the elevator. His footsteps echoed in the vast lobby, each step a reminder that power did not come from wealth alone. It came from resilience. As the elevator doors slid shut behind him, the reality of the moment settled over the Grand Royale like a storm passing through. And for the first time in years, the hotel belonged to the right man. As the elevator ascended, James Blackwell leaned against the polished walls, closing his eyes for a brief moment. This wasn't triumph. This wasn't some grand act of revenge. It was simply balance restored. Outside, Richard Davenport remained standing in the cold, his hands clenching into fists before slowly unraveling. He had spent years believing power made him untouchable, until he touched the wrong man. Back inside, the Grand Royale seemed to breathe differently. The weight of arrogance, of exclusivity, of silent cruelty had been lifted. Employees whispered in hushed tones, realizing they had just witnessed something extraordinary. Guests who had laughed before now sat in reflective silence, replaying their own judgments in their minds. And Mr. Holloway? He smiled. a small, knowing smile. James had not just reclaimed the Grand Royale. He had rewritten its future. Before stepping out of the elevator, James turned to the mirrored walls and adjusted his collar. The man who had walked in tonight, mocked, humiliated, discarded, was not the same man who was walking out, because this time he wasn't leaving. Sometimes the world forgets that true power doesn't come from money or status. It comes from resilience, dignity, and the ability to rise again. What would you have done if you were in James Blackwell's shoes? Drop your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear your take. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Who knows? The next story might just change the way you see the world.